Hello, my name is Mark Ellis from Stick and Rudder Studios, and today we're going to do another tutorial for XCamera 2.4. And in this tutorial I want to cover AI perspective, which is a particular kind of a view that you can have on an external camera, looking at any of the AI planes that XPlane supports. We're also going to go over community camera files, and as a last topic, look at the various settings you can have in the settings dialog within XCamera. So why don't we hop right into XPlane and take a look at what this AI perspective is all about. Okay, so here we are in XPlane and in our trusty Cessna 172, and let's talk a little bit about AI perspective. I think most of you probably know that XPlane comes with a feature where you can configure a number of artificial intelligent planes that will fly around, take off, land at airports, and fly around in the vicinity of your aircraft. There are also a number of other plugins that take advantage of this AI aircraft concept. A good example would be something like live traffic, which takes ADS-B data and feeds that and tries to generate traffic around you. Also, there are various online networks like POSCON, the Positive Control Network, and VATSIM, where they actually use this AI aircraft technique, to render and display traffic, from the online network around your aircraft. So XCamera's got the ability to take any one of your external cameras and actually put it on a number of the AI aircraft, that are flying around you. So let's take a look at that. If we come in here, I have a whole bunch of cameras that I've got defined here, and I'm going to go to the tail camera. And I think what I'll do is I'll pin the mini control panel so you can see this. If there are AI aircraft in the system, this button down here is going to show up on any external camera. It doesn't work obviously for internal cameras, but it works on any external cameras. And with AI perspective, if you turn it on, what it's going to do is it's going to put a camera on the back of a particular AI aircraft. And then also you're going to see that some other controls will show up down here. Number one, this is going to show you, this is for 11.5, XPlane 11.5, where they added some additional information that goes in the TCAS system. So here we've got the tail number, and I actually think if I come over here we can see N43XX, that matches. And these arrows will show you if you have more than one AI aircraft, this will let you toggle through them. So here we're taking a look at another AI plane that's flying around. You see the tail number matches. Here's another one. And there's another one. And you can just kind of go back and forth between these things. And pretty much any external camera will work with these things. So as an example, let's do an orbit around this guy. Or I could come over and do an orbit around this one. Let's try one that's up in the air. Do flybys. Even these fancy animations like this will work. Okay, the other place where AI perspective works is with airport cameras. So if we come here and we go to this, as I train around here, let's see if I can just get this plane. What the camera is going to do on airport cameras is going to train on the particular AI aircraft that you've got selected. So here we're looking at N43XX. I believe that's this guy right here. I'm going to zoom in with my joystick zoom control that I've got here. There's another plane that's on the ground. See, they've got two of them at this airport. Here's one that's up in the air, but there we can see it. It's pretty far away, but it's still visible. Yep, and there's the helicopter. So this is a pretty fun feature if you want to do plane spotting with artificial intelligent aircraft. And again, it works with any of the X-Plane AI aircraft. It'll work with things like live traffic. This particular version now is relying on the new TCAS API that was put in 11.5. I do know that as these other traffic plugins start to adopt this new TCAS API, it's going to work much better. It generally works, in earlier versions of 11, but not all of the plugins manipulate the AI traffic data refs very well. And with this new TCAS API that Laminar's put in, as plugin developers adopt that, I think you're going to find that this AI perspective will work better and better and better with each one. But it's fun to play with. You can give that a try. And all you have to do is, let me show you. There's one thing about scale up and scale down. If it was a real big plane, what you may find, let's actually get back to a tail view. If I'm a small plane like a Cessna 172 right now, if I just shut this off, this is where my camera is in relationship to my plane. Now this works pretty good in the case where the AI aircraft is roughly the same size as mine. But let's assume that this AI aircraft is a big 747. Well, what's going to happen is that camera is going to be too close. And one of the challenges X camera has, it doesn't really know how big any of the AI aircraft that you currently have selected. It doesn't know how big they are. So we've got these little buttons here, scale up and scale down, that will simply scale the camera's distance up and down, so that you can compensate for maybe a larger plane or a smaller plane that you may be looking at from an AI perspective. Okay? All right. So that covers AI perspective. The next thing I want to cover is community files. So I think with all the previous tutorials, we saw how you can go through and you can create all your cameras by hand. There is an ability to submit an aircraft file that you've done to the community and an ability to import one, into kind of a blank plane. So why don't we see how we can do that? What I'm going to do is come up here and I'm going to kind of wipe this file out and make it like it's back to its very beginning again. So let's assume we had just hopped in X-Plane. And I enabled X camera for the very first time on the Cessna 172. I'm going to end up with a camera file that has the one cockpit camera and the one pilot camera. Now what I could do is I can go out and see if anybody in the community has created a camera set for this plane, and I can import it. So to do that, we'd come up here and we go to Browse Community Aircraft Files, and you can see that there are 3,736 files, that have been submitted. And I currently have a filter in here with my name on it. I'm going to take that off. And now you see we're actually looking at all 3,736 files. And I can use these arrow keys to kind of go through them and see, what has been, created by all the various people. It'll show you the aircraft it's for. Usually there's an author name. The version of X camera that it was using, the number of cameras, number of categories, what's the default field of view that they had in their graphic settings. So clearly we're not going to go toggling through 3,736 files. So what I can do is I can look for something like C172, as an example, and I can see that there are 65. And obviously I'm looking at the Coronado, Albeo. So it sort of does a regular expression search, or basically a case-insensitive search through the aircraft name or the author name. I know that I've created a number of these, so I'm going to come in here and put Marquis, which is the author name that I've used, and I can see all the planes that I put in. Okay, so here's a Cessna 172. I think I would like to import this. Now, there is a little thing down here which I think I may have showed you before when we did the copy and paste camera set option. If the plane's not an exact match, say as an example, maybe what I was doing is trying to bring in a camera set from a Baron 58 or a plane that's maybe larger than the Cessna 172. Well, the challenge you've got is all of your camera definitions are their X, Y, and Z coordinates are relative to the center of gravity of the plane. So the plane's basically just different sizes. Where the pilot seat is in a Baron relative to its center of gravity is different than where the pilot seat is relative to the center of gravity of a Cessna 172. So this checkbox down here tries to fix that up. Okay, the way it works is before importing, it's going to look at where your current cockpit and pilot view is, and this has got to be the very first category and the very first camera, because that's what it uses as a reference point. So it says, okay, where, and if I just cancel this, you can actually see this. Where is this camera relative to the center of gravity? And we could see down here in these XYZ coordinates that the camera is 0.24 meters to the left of the center of gravity. It's 0.35 meters above the center of gravity, and it's 0.061 meters forward of the center of gravity. Okay. Now, when I try to import a community file, let's just come up here and okay, we got this 172. It's gonna, if I check this, what it's going to do is it's going to look at in this file what are the relative differences, distances XYZ for that camera file that I'm importing from, and it simply looks and says what's the delta between those two, and it makes an attempt to correct or basically adjust all of the cameras so that they generally will fit better with the plane that you're trying to import them into. It's not perfect, okay? And quite frankly, anytime you bring something in from a community file, you're likely going to have to fuss around a little bit, but at least it gets it close. Now in this example, it's going to come out to be a perfect match because this is a 172 and I was the guy that made this plane, so everything's going to match kind of perfectly. So if I import this, it's going to bring all those cameras in, and then I could do a save all. Now a couple of things about importing community files. There are pros and cons to it. I think the biggest pro to it is you can get a sense of how all these different users of X camera have set their cameras up. Particularly where it's useful is looking at any fancy animations they may have done or fancy sequences. You can import them and just sort of browse around and take a look and see what they did. The challenge with community files is no two authors set things up the same way. Everybody's got their own unique preferences in the way they want to set these cameras up. And it's highly unlikely, unless you happen to find a particular author where you love the way they do it, and they have been very consistent and they have submitted a lot of planes that you use to the community, maybe you could get away with importing camera files from a common author, and that way you're going to get some consistency. But if you found a camera file that I did, and then you find another camera file for a different plane that let's say that Joe Schmo did, it's highly unlikely there's going to be any consistency to the way they define those cameras. And you're going to end up with a situation where every plane you get into, it's going to be different. So there are limitations to the value of these community files, where I think they're really useful is just getting a sense of how other people do it. And then ultimately, you can create your own. Depending on how complicated they made it, maybe you can use theirs as a base and then just fuss around with it a little bit and adjust them to the way you want them. Okay? Now, let's say, for instance, you've come in here and you've created a really great camera file and you'd like to share it, with the community. You could do that too. You come up here and you go to share camera file with the community. And the first thing it's going to do is it's going to go up and look and see on the community server how many camera files for that same plane type. And it's going to go off of the name for the ACF file, that X-Plane recognizes as plane as. And here it's going to tell me there are 183 camera files for the Cessna 172 that people have submitted. Right there and there, I might want to ask myself, is mine going to be that much better than these 183 that have already been submitted? If you're proud of what you've done, go ahead and submit it. For me, I'd look at this and go, what, my contribution to the existing 183 is probably not going to do much. But if this were a relatively new plane that just came out in the market and there weren't a lot of them out there, sometimes it is very valuable to go ahead and submit it. But I'm going to go ahead and submit this anyways. All you do is come down here. You have to put in an author name. Doesn't have to be your real name, okay? But don't put anything bad language in there. And do be consistent. If you submit a number of files, use the same author name, because if people love the way you do things, they might actually like to import a lot of your camera files. So I'm just going to use Marquis, which is my handle. You have to have a version number. And I recommend that what we do is we just use a date timestamp, and I can just say now, and it'll update this to the current date timestamp. And this helps it to recognize your file, and if you've got multiple versions of it. Like if I submitted this, and then I came in later on, and I made some changes to it, and I wanted to submit it again, it will recognize, that I've already submitted it once. It'll make me change the version, and then what it will do is it'll delete my old one from the community server and add this new one. Once I've done this all, I can go ahead and hit submit, and it gets submitted. And it'll be available for everybody if they want to bring it down and use it. So that's a little bit about community files. Again, my take on them is they're quite valuable for looking at how other people have done things and seeing if you want to, kind of adopt, their techniques in doing it. And you can, use it to as a base, to get started with, but recognize its limitations. Importing camera files for widely varying different planes, like trying to load a 737 camera file into a Cessna 172, it's not going to work that good. Same way going the opposite way, it's not going to work that great. But I do think it's got some value, and you can play with it and experiment with it. And again, you can always get back to a base again by simply coming up here and saying new aircraft file, and you could start all over again. Okay. The next thing I want to talk about is settings. And you can get to your settings dialog by right here. These are a number of global settings. They're settings that are relevant to the X camera installation. They're not unique to a particular camera or a particular plane. Anything that's camera specific or plane specific gets saved in the camera file for that aircraft in the X-Plane aircraft directory. These are settings, that are global to your installation of X camera, and I want to kind of go through them and show you what they all mean. So starting at the top here, we've got these movement increments, and you got small, medium, large, and very large, and you have them for the pan speed, the movement speed, head tracking, range. Now let me show you. We sort of hit on this in a couple of places. If you remember, on a camera, there's a movement increment drop down here which goes small, medium, large, and very large. This equates to these up here. And what are these for? Well, let me give you an example. I've got this set to a medium right now. And in medium, for each click of the arrow keys, how far will that camera move in meters? So as I click my arrow key, you're going to see how quickly this thing moves, left and right, up and down. Now if I had gone to a tail camera, let's actually go ahead and do that. And I got this tail camera set to medium. Now I'm going to move that arrow key. You can hardly see the camera moving. It's just, the trouble is for an external camera that's a ways away from the plane, you're going to want to move it a lot more than that, This little dinky distance here is not going to cut the mustard. So what I'm going to do is I come up here on this tail camera, and I'm going to set it to large. Now as I move it, you can see it moves, a lot further. If I were trying to move these around, say in an airport camera, or I wanted to move this camera a big distance away from the plane, then I could set it to very large. So what you can do here is you can control for each of these increments how much movement you're going to get for things like, moving the arrow keys and such. Same is true with the pan speed and degrees. As I pan around, with the hat switch, how much of a rotation do I want, okay, for each of these things. The same thing is true with head tracking. If you've got track IR, and these are not your rotational speeds with your head. It's like if I lean forward or I lean back or I lean left or I lean right, how much head movement do I want to get? And this is a factor. It's not going to be, so it's going to tell you, how much would I move one way or the other. I can make this larger in the case of, say, I have track IR on and I'm on an external camera. I might want, as I lean left and right and forward back, I might want those to be a little bit bigger. So you can adjust those here, with your head tracking. Okay, let's talk about pan speed factor. In X camera, and I think what I might do is actually bring up a cool tool here. I want to just divert a little bit and talk about. There is a tool that you can get. There's a link to it in the X camera user guide called the data ref tool. This thing is fantastic, okay, for being able to see all the various commands that you can do in X-Plane and actually experiment with them and trying them without having to constantly go in and map a key to it to see what it does. So I'm going to bring this data ref tool up, and I'm actually going to go here to commands, and I'm going to look for a command called rotation. And I know that command's called sim general rotate left, down, fast, and slow. Okay, so let's just try left. And what I could do is it's probably best if I get myself on a cockpit camera here. So if I rotate left, see how the camera rotates? I can go rotate right, and there's a fast and a slow and a normal. Okay. This pan speed factor has to do with this fast, slow, and normal. On normal, these pan speed degrees are going to get multiplied by 1. Okay? If I'm clicking the fast mode, like rotate right fast, this pan speed factor is going to multiply that. So if I've got a pan speed, let's say for medium range, it's 1 degree movement for every click of that command. If I go pan speed fast, it's going to multiply that by 3. So it'll go 3 degrees. If it's pan speed slow, it's going to divide that by 3 degrees. So it'll be 1/3 of a degree that it's going to move. So pan speed factor, it's simply a multiply by 3 for fast times 1, for normal, or 1/3 in the case for a slow movement. And the same thing is true for movement speed. And let me just quickly show you that. Actually, it's probably best if I get this camera back to restored mode. Okay. So as I use the arrows to move around, there are some qualifiers to this. If I do a shift, it'll go faster. If I don't do shift, it goes a little slower. If I hit control and arrow keys, it's going to go even slower. Okay? Same concept here. Without the shift or the control key, it's going to multiply these values up here by 1. If I'm holding the shift key down, which is move faster with the arrow keys, it's going to multiply it by 3. So you can see, and if I use the control key, which is the slow movement, it's going to divide it by 3 for whatever I have up here in this setting. So you have a very large degree of control over setting this thing up for how you want movement to act, okay, based upon, what movement speed increment you've got set on that camera, small, medium, large, very large, okay? And if you ever want to get it back to like the defaults, just, hit default. These default settings down here, we'll put them to what I think are a reasonable set. Okay, movement smoothing factor. I think most of you are probably used to the concept in X-Plane that as you move the arrow keys, it doesn't stop immediately. Here in X camera by default, it's jumpy, but it's very accurate. As soon as I let up on the key, it stops immediately. In X-Plane, it tends to slow down. It kind of accelerates and deaccelerates, and it has a little bit more of a fluid movement. So with this movement speed factor, I can sort of have that same kind of effect. So if I'm going to set it to say 15, then as I move, notice how I lit up on the arrow key. See how it doesn't stop immediately. Some people like this. You know, I don't particularly care for it. I prefer that it stop immediately. But if you're trying to, you know, use your arrow keys to move around outside the plane and stuff, sometimes this smoothing factor, okay, is valuable. I'm going to go ahead and set it back to 0. Mouse smoothing. So if I do a mouse look, I've got some smoothing on here. If I were to remove this mouse smoothing factor, bring it down to say 1, you can see it's really very responsive, but also really jittery, right? Because just a little tiny bit of the mouse is going to move that around. Let me actually come up here real quick and turn on retain mouse look position. Okay, and if I put this back to say a 10, then it's a little bit nicer. Okay, so you can fuss around with that. Same thing is true with the head track smoothing factor. I don't have my Track IR headset on right at the moment, so we can't look at this, but it's the same concept. I mean, with Track IR, as you move your head, it's the same thing as doing a mouse look. So you can set, you know, what do you want for head tracking smoothing factor in here. View axis smoothing factor. X camera can accept input from joysticks that have their axes set up for the view axis in X-Plane. And as a matter of fact, let me just show you that. I don't have any of them set up, but I can show you quickly where you do this in X-Plane. For those of you who want to know, you go to joystick. I'm going to go to my HOTAS. And actually right now you can see it. I have the throttle. I've got it set to view zoom. But there's a whole bunch of view inputs that you can use here, like camera left right, camera up down, camera zoom, view left, view right. You can configure a spare joystick to do all of these view inputs, and X camera can take those inputs and apply them to the camera. These view axis smoothing factors allow you to set how much smoothing do you want as you're getting those joystick axis inputs. And I have it by default, it sets it to a smoothing factor of 5. The last thing is a camera smoothing factor. And when we were doing transitions, there is a concept in the transitions. I'm going to actually bring up control panel here and show it to you really quick. Actually, been able to do it on the flyby, okay? Well, maybe the orbit's a better one. So between each transition point, there is a thing here called, let me just see if I can find it, enable smooth camera joins. And I think if you remember correctly when I showed you, if you have multiple linear transitions that you've got auto advance on between those linear transitions, the point where the two linear transitions join, the camera can make a relatively abrupt angle change as it's trying to adapt, okay, to that new linear transition. You won't see this with Bezier transitions, but you can see it, okay, with linear transitions, and it's particularly abrupt if you don't have this enable smooth camera joins on. If you've got this on, what X camera tries to do is it tries to create a Bezier curve around the join point where the two linear transitions join together. And by default, it's going to give you 30 frames before and 30 frames after the join point. So this is what this camera smoothing factor is like, what's the total number of frames, okay, that we're going to try to do that join smoothing over. And by default it's set to 60. It tries to go, again, go 30 before and it has a Bezier curve control point right at the join point, and then another control point 30 frames after. So what it does is, as you hit those join points, it'll make the join in the linear join of the linear transitions smoother. And again, this was added way before we had Bezier curve transitions, but now that we've got Bezier curve transitions, you don't really need it as much. It's often a Bezier curve, with a number of control point cameras actually does a better job. Okay, so let's get down to all these checkboxes and what these means. Enable Auto Show Mini Control Panel, and I think I can show this to you. Let me just close these down here. Go to the cockpit camera. Okay, by default, when I put my mouse down towards the bottom of the screen, this mini control panel is going to pop up. If I don't want it to do that, you'll notice it stops. Okay, now what that means is I have to now toggle the mini control panel by hand, and there's a command to do it. There is also this menu option, to be able to do it. So I can have a command that I've got adopted to that, and I can, toggle it back and forth, okay, by hand. With this on, it'll come up as soon as I put the mouse down in that general area, and then I can pin it if I wish. Open Mini Control Panel on Start. With this on, as soon as X Camera is enabled, if I check this, the Mini Control Panel is going to automatically open, and it will be pinned, and I can unpin it and let it close if I want it to be there. Show target information. If you remember back in our target cameras, as soon as the target camera is selected, a little box came up showing me the target information. That's toggleable. You can toggle that on or off with a command. You can also toggle it on or off with the in the mini control panel when you're on a target following camera. This just sets up what's it going to do by default. Okay. Pause aiming when aiming a target. If you're trying to aim a target camera with the right mouse button, sometimes that could be a bit of a pain if the plane's moving. So with this on, what it'll do is it'll pause the sim, let you complete the aiming with the right mouse click, and as soon as you've got it aimed, as soon as you let go of the right mouse click, it'll unpause the simulator. Okay. This lock keyboard control, I'll let you read about that in the manual. It's really got to do with a conflict of commands to do with the up and down arrow keys with ATC. So if you turn this on, you won't be able to move the camera around with the arrow keys unless you've got the control panel open. And you can read about this in the user guides. I'm not even sure it's even relevant anymore for X-Plane 11. I'd have to go back and look at it, but there was a conflict in, what the arrow keys meant, and if you at one point they meant popping up your ATC panel. Okay, enable solid control panel. By default, when you bring up the control panel, this is usually brought up translucent when you first bring it up. And of course you can undo it, with this little, checkbox here. This can set it to how you want it by default. With enable solid control panel, when you open it for the very first time, it'll stay solid, and of course you can switch it. Okay. Same thing with the enable transparent mini control panel. If I bring this up and pin it, you can see it's got a solid background. If I put it on transparent, now it's got a translucent background. Okay. Disable quick look emulation. By default, X camera will respond to the numeric keys, which are by default mapped to your X-Plane quick look commands. And you'll remember when we talked about view commands, typically numeric keypad 0, which is quick look 0, is going to map to view ID 1 on your camera. If you don't want X camera to respond to any quick look commands, you can shut this off. All right, and then you've got to use the SRS X camera select underbar view ID, commands to do that. All right. Hide favorites in the mini control panel. by default, and let's see if we can see this here. If we go to like the orbits, oh, it's the favorites. I'm sorry. I'm getting a little bit confused here. Let me go up and make my pilot view a favorite by giving it a view ID. All right, notice that the pilot view is now showing up as a green button in the mini control panel. That indicates it's a favorite. It's a camera that's got a view ID assigned to it, and I can quickly go to it. If I don't want these in here, I can shut them off. See, now they don't show up. Now, the benefit you get with it is you get a little bit of a, it's not as tall of a mini control panel, but the disadvantage is I don't see my favorite cameras anymore. To get to anything, I've got to, select the individual category and then pick the camera in that category. If I turn that back on again, they show up. And then I have to make this a little bit bigger. Okay. Enable force field of view. You have the ability, as long as you're not running a multi-monitor configuration, and I mean in X-Plane a multi-monitor configuration where you literally have this X-Plane cockpit screen here being rendered across 2 or more monitors. As long as you're using it with just one monitor for your X-Plane view, you do have the ability to force the field of view on each camera. In order to be able to do that, you have to check that. And then if I bring up my control panel here and go to show advanced settings, you can see what shows up down here is a checkbox called force field of view. And I can set what I want the field of view to be on that one camera. If I shut this off, that option goes away over on the control panel. And by default, it's off. And the reason why it's off is because it simply is not supported on a multi-monitor configuration. And it used to be I always had this on, but people were getting confused and they were wondering, why doesn't it not work okay with multiple monitors? In general, I don't really like to see us using field of view. I think what you should be doing is moving the camera in closer or further away. But on rare occasions, you might want to force the field of view. Just remember, this only works, okay, if you're using a single monitor configuration for your simulator view. That doesn't mean you can't have more than one monitor in your system. It just means you cannot be spanning your simulator view across more than one monitor, because this field of view thing simply is not going to work. Okay. Always show advanced camera options. You'll notice that without that set, every time I bring up the control panel, this show advanced camera options is going to be off. And you do get a little warning here if you happen to have some advanced camera options set and you're not able to see them. If I put that on, then what's going to happen is every time I bring up the control panel, of course this is if you bring up for the very first time, that option should be set. Okay? Okay, disable voice messages. Let's come back here and bring up my data ref tool, view commands, and I'm going to put a filter in here, select underbar view. Okay, here's all my select underbar view ID commands. So we know we've got one, that's my cockpit. If I try to hit this one,
unable to find view ID 10.
You get a voice prompt telling you it can't find that view ID. If I don't want to be listening to that, I can check that. Now as I press this, or any of these other ones where I don't have a view ID, I don't get the voice prompt. The other thing this is also is used for is when you add cameras or categories, you'll get a text-to-speech voice telling you that that camera was added. So you can turn these on or off, with this option down here. Another one is the mouse look behavior. Back before X-Plane or X-Camera 2.4, we didn't have the ability to do a mouse look using the right mouse button. Now with new features that X-Plane 11's got in it, X-Camera 2.4 can support a right mouse click movement. So this is here for historical reasons. People may still like using the middle mouse button, okay, for a mouse look. So here we can say, what do we want the middle mouse to do? I have it right now set on mouse look, which means that if I come over here and I press my middle mouse, it'll do the same thing that it does if I use the right mouse. Okay. The other thing I could do is I could set it to do the toggle zoom lock. Let's come on down here to my radios. I'm going to bring this up and I'm going to hit the disable cockpit zoom. Right now, if I'm moving the wheel, it's not zooming. But if I have this on toggle zoom lock, if I click the middle mouse button, I can now smooth a zoom. If I click it again, it's locked out. So this allows you to lock and unlock that based upon the middle mouse button. I actually think we can see it toggle. Let's see if it toggles. It does. See the disable zoom lock? As I come in here and I click the middle mouse button, oops, I clicked on something I shouldn't have. As I click the middle mouse button, that toggles on and off. Okay? Or I can have it be none, which means the middle mouse button is not going to do anything, you know, within X-Camera. Okay, update community files on start. By default with this on, when X-Camera starts up, it's going to go out to the community file server and see if there are any new camera files that you don't have in your local cache. And if there are some, it will, in the background, download those community camera files. It does this using a separate thread, so it should not in any way slow down how fast X-Plane comes up and starts running, nor is it really going to have any material bearing on your frame rate. It'll do this all in the background. If you don't use browse community files very often, you won't want to just consider, you know, disabling that, because what it's doing is it is using your internet connection to bring down these new files. Now keep in mind, these camera files are small, they're simple comma delimited text files, they're not very big, it's not going to be using a lot of bandwidth, so I wouldn't worry about it too much. But in all honesty, if you don't bother to import cameras from the community file, there's no reason to try to update your cache. Just recognize that if you have this shut off and you go for months on end, the first time you turn it back on again, it may take it a while, okay, to refresh your community file cache to get it up to snuff, okay, with the latest things that have been put in there. Okay, and the last thing is use small font for both control panels. Right now we're using an 18-point font for the control panel and mini control panel. It works pretty good. What you might find though is it's taking up more space than you like. If you just got a 1080p monitor, you might want to use the smaller fonts, which I believe is a 15-point font. So if I click that, you notice that this gets a little bit smaller. It's not quite as tall, a little harder to read. Same true with the mini control panel. It takes up a little less space, but the font's a little bit smaller. Okay. What I find is that this larger font, you know, I'm a little older guy, it's easier for me to read, and quite frankly, it looks pretty good, okay, when you got like a 4K monitor. You know, it's a reasonable size. Sometimes too on a 4K monitor, if you're using the X-Plane option to scale your view, and actually come up here and look at where this is. I probably can't do because I'm running in windowed mode, but there is a thing down here, okay, where you can change this, okay, to scale at 150%. If you set that to scale, it's also going to scale the X-Camera UI. And what you might find is with this larger font and a 4K scale, now maybe the user interface is just a little bit too big, and you want to go back to down to using that smaller font size. So there are a lot of options here. I realize it can be a little overwhelming. I would say in general, the default settings, okay, tend to be the pretty good ones, and then just try experimenting, okay, with the various things, okay, that you want to that you want to work with and experiment and see whether they do what you want them to do. Okay, I think that covers pretty much everything for XCamera 2.4. I know it's a lot of tutorials, a lot to get through, but it is a relatively robust plugin with a lot of features, so it was a lot of material to cover. Hopefully you found these tutorials to be useful, and I hope they help you to get more out of XCamera. Thank you very much, and have a wonderful time flying X-Plane.